anyway. So welcome everybody, and thank you for joining us today for this joint webinar between WeAll, the Wellbeing Economy Alliance Scotland, and Future Economy Scotland. And we're both organisations are involved in a couple of other coalition efforts. So this is also brought to you today by Tax Justice Scotland Coalition, by the Scottish Wellbeing Economy Strategy Group. And we'll tell you a bit more about both of those towards the end. So really happy to have you all in the room with us today. And we hope that you might have already had a chance to read one or both of the reports that we're going to be hearing about today. But if not, we'll be circulating the links to everything afterwards as well. So we're going to hear today from Lukas, Bunse, my colleague at WeAll Scotland, on WeAll's new research, Sharing Our Wealth, which is all about public attitudes in Scotland to wealth inequality and progressive tax reforms. And we're also going to have a presentation from Laurie Macfarlane at Future Economy Scotland from their latest research on funding Scotland's future tax reform for a just transition. So these two reports taken together are really complementary, which is why we're bringing this into one conversation today. We are both trying to knock down barriers to progressive reform. And in WeAll's case, that barrier is the myth that public opinion is intransigent when it comes to tackling wealth inequality. As you'll hear from Lukas in a moment, the Scottish public really do understand the issues with wealth inequality, and there's a really strong message that people are ready for change. Laurie's report that he'll then go on to talk about sets out what's possible within the current powers of the Scottish Government and Parliament, which chips away at another myth that it's impossible to do anything about inequality within the current devolved settlement. So really looking forward to hearing from both of them and then getting into some conversations. So the way we'll spend our time together today is I'll hand over first to Lukas, who'll present the findings from Sharing Our Wealth, and then to Laurie, who'll present the findings from Funding Scotland's Future. And then we'll have plenty of time for Q&A and conversation. So while you're listening, feel free to use the chat to share your thoughts and particularly to share any questions for either of them, and then we'll open up the discussion towards the end. But when we get to Q&A, you can also put your hand up and speak into the space as well. So without any further ado, I'll hand over to Dr. Lukas Bunse from WeAll Scotland to present the findings of Sharing Our Wealth. Lukas.
Fantastic. Thank you, Lisa. And I'll just briefly share my screen, so give me a minute to make that work. So yeah, I'm hoping you can all see that. Shout if you don't. So yeah, it's fantastic to see so many people here, and to have this joint webinar kind of bringing together quite a few different groups and organizations. So quite pleased to share the findings of our research. As Lisa said, kind of the fun for us, the motivation behind this research is really coming from the kind of big wealth inequality in Scotland. So we know from Scottish Government statistics that about 10% of the richest households own about 40% of all wealth, and probably the richest one in there, quite a significant chunk again, whereas the bottom 10% of households essentially have no wealth or are even in debt. And for us, that wealth inequality is one of the biggest obstacles to building a well-being economy, because it prevents us from using a lot of our societal resources for tackling the challenges that we're facing. And it also concentrates power in the hand of quite a few people who have a vested interest in keeping the economy as it is. And politicians have been telling us for a long time that they can't or don't want to meaningfully tackle that. So we conducted this research to find out what the Scottish public think and to see whether there's public support for political action on wealth inequality and wealth taxation. And to do that, we commissioned the Diffley Partnership to run a survey with more than 2,000 respondents using an online panel. And then we recruited 38 participants from those surveys to run 6 focus groups to dig into the issues a bit more in depth as well. And I will briefly go over some of the key findings, but there's a lot more detail in the report. So one of the first key findings we found is that there is quite a large majority of people in Scotland who think that wealth inequality is a problem. So when we ask people whether they think the gap between those with a little wealth and those with a lot of wealth is too large or too small, basically 83% of respondents said that it is too large. And similarly, we then follow up with a question where we gave people two options to say whether they think wealth inequality is more harmful to Scottish society or good, kind of deliberately forcing people to get off the fence, not giving them a kind of a middle option or a don't know option. And we found that when we did that, that there's quite a high level of concern around the impacts of wealth inequality. And in the focus groups, people really highlighted concerns about how inequality impacts those at the bottom of the distribution, how it leaves people in poverty. And a lot of people were aware that that inequality is driven by structural drivers and not just down to individual hard work. And so when we asked people again in this survey whether it's because of their own hard work or because of or whether individuals are wealthy because of their own hard work or because of lack of circumstances they were born into, then 2/3 answered that it's more like luck and circumstances at birth. And the interesting thing, especially about the first two questions that I mentioned, is that that's not related specifically to people who don't have any wealth. So even among respondents who reported higher levels of wealth, we tended to think about that people who had like more than £300,000, or people who thought about themselves as being more wealthy than the average. We still get very high numbers saying that inequality is too large and that it is harmful, around 80% as well. So we really found a kind of desire, a very strong shared desire for a more unequal society. So both in the focus groups and in the survey, we showed people these 5 diagrams, which basically give you different kind of hypothetical shapes of how a society could look like. And we asked people what they think, which of these comes closest to how Scotland is at the moment. And we found that most people picked, or the biggest group picked type B, followed by type A. So about 70% of respondents in the survey picked the two most unequal distributions on the left. Whereas if we then ask people how they think Scotland should look like in an ideal world, the biggest group was type D, followed by type E. So about 80% of people picked the opposite picture. So picked the two kind of much more equal distributions that you can see on the right. And we found that then that kind of concern about a more equal society does translate into quite significant support for higher taxes as well, especially on the wealthy. So when we ask people whether taxes on the wealthy should be increased or whether they should be reduced, 85% of people said they should be increased. And again, this is not just the people who don't have any wealth, but even among 80% of people who indicated that they think they're wealthier than the average, still said that taxes on the wealthy should be increased, which resonates with some of the research and messaging from other groups such as Patriotic Millionaires. So there's a concern across society with these issues. But we also know from other research, including some of the stuff that Laurie is going to be talking about, that taxing just the wealthy is probably not going to be enough for the kind of needs that we need to fund. And so we did explore a little bit the trade-offs inherent in kind of broader tax rises that do not just impact the wealthy. And so in the survey, we gave people these 4 scenarios of different kind of ways of tax rises. And the bottom 2 are basically scenarios where the government asks everyone to pay a bit more to adequately fund public services, but in different ways. And you can see that the bottom one, where that is done in a progressive way with the wealthiest paying the most, but and the least wealthy paying a little, that is very much the most popular options, getting more than 56% of respondents. There's also a small group who are happy for everyone to pay more, but they want that to be a flat rate. And then the top 2 scenarios where it's basically different ones where we have measures that would not fund adequately public services. So the top one basically would be the option not to ask anyone to pay any more taxes. We got 12% for that. But then there's quite a significant minority for the second one, which is basically the option, where people saying the wealthy should pay more tax, but not everyone, even if that's not quite enough. And interestingly, that position was disproportionately popular among younger respondents in the survey. And we didn't just look at kind of support for tax rises in principle, but we also looked at a few kind of slightly more specific options. So in the survey, we tested 5 of them. The top one was to introduce a tax on private jets. The second one is to reform council tax so that those owning high value properties pay more. The third one is having an annual tax on all wealth. The fourth one is a one-off wealth tax. And the fifth one is a tax on all land and property based on land values. And you can see that all of these options got more support than opposition. So the kind of the dark blue and light blue bar on the left are bigger than kind of the orange and pink on the right. And the top 3 options even had more than 50% of people saying they strongly support or some would support the policy. And again, the pattern that I've highlighted before we find here is rather that support is not just among people who don't have very much wealth. Again, respondents who reported higher levels of wealth or who reported kind of that they think they're wealthier than the average also had more than 50% support for the top 3 policies that were there. The report levels were a bit lower, but it's still quite high. And then in the end, we also kind of dug a little bit into council tax as a kind of more specific case study. And in the focus groups, we found that there's a lot of frustration with the current council tax system. It's probably fair to say people find it confusing that similar properties pay very different rates. Not all of them were aware that it's based on values from 1999 or 1991, although most people knew it was quite a long time ago, and they think it was quite ridiculous that we haven't updated anything since then. And people were also quite frustrated with declining quality of services despite increasing rates. And again, that kind of frustration translated into support for reform, as the survey shows. Like we had that kind of more general option in that question. And then we also looked at kind of 3 specific ones that the Scottish government proposed, which is kind of a revaluation, a kind of one-off update and increasing the number of council tax bands. And again, all 3 of them got quite significant levels of support. So overall, I think what we really found is that most people support progressive tax rises in principle. And that was very much grounded in an understanding that taxation is an important part of supporting social outcomes, whether that is good public services or poverty reduction. And for me, that was really quite a heartening thing listening into the focus groups, is that most people do actually care. So they care about their community. They want to support people in poverty. They want good public services for everyone. And they're not just looking at this through an individual lens and their own benefits. And people are also able to have quite nuanced and in-depth discussion about tax and society, I thought. Does that mean that everybody is, super keen to pay more taxes in Scotland? Obviously not. So people did have concerns, but most of them we found were more about the practicalities of how it's done rather than opposition in principle. And we kind of summarized kind of 3 recommendations coming out of that. And so the first one of that is that proposals need to be progressive and visibly target the wealthiest first. Otherwise, most people would probably think that's unfair. People are also quite concerned about unintended consequences, especially on those who are already vulnerable or who might not afford tax rises in terms of wealth taxation, especially households who might have some assets but not a lot of income, such as pensioners or large families. And so I think it's quite important to recognize that that's also coming from a place of care for these households. But it means that, we do have to be quite explicit about how such households would be protected in the case of tax reform, or even better off generally than in the current system. And last but very much not least is that people generally showed support in principle for these kind of proposals, but they really don't trust politicians to do it properly at the moment. So any tax reforms need to produce some visible benefits, and we need much greater transparency about how money is raised and spent. But I think there's really a lot of frustration there, and I think if that is done well, it could really be actually an opportunity to restore some of the trust in politicians that has been kind of not in a good place recently. So yeah, so if we want to build a well-being economy and tackle the climate and nature crisis, eradicate poverty, improve public services, we will need to tap into the wealth accumulated at the top of society, and possibly even into kind of broader taxation measures. And the key message from our research is quite clear that there is majority in support in Scotland for well-designed tax reforms that are progressive and protect the most vulnerable households. So I think politicians don't need to do a lot of convincing that this needs to be done, but they need to demonstrate that they can do it well and lead with a kind of clarity, fairness, and credibility. And again, I think then it can be an opportunity to win back the trust of voters. Obviously, what we didn't explicitly look into is that there will be some very loud opposition to this from vested interests, especially from some corners of the media. How we deal with that is maybe a conversation for another day, but our research shows that that is very much a minority position and should not be used as an excuse to stick with the status quo. And I'm quite excited now to hand over to Laurie to hear a bit more about the fantastic research they've done on the kind of practical measures that the Scottish Government could take.
Okay, thanks very much, Lucas. Can everyone hear me okay? Yes, perfect. Okay, I will just share my screen as well. Do let me know if we all good. Okay, brilliant. Well, firstly, thanks very much for coming along today. It's really great to see such a good turnout to talk all things to do with tax and inequality. So, just by way of background, first. As Lisa said, I'm Laurie Macfarlane, co-director at Future Economy Scotland. And for the past sort of 18 months or so, one of the things we've been doing is working on this report, which just came out a couple of weeks ago. And the kind of context for this is recognizing that if you're someone who spends any time working around Scottish politics, trying to get progressive change, you'll no doubt encounter the reality, which is there's a question that acts as a bigger barrier, more than any other. And that question is, how will we pay for it? And that question is a very legitimate question, particularly given that the Scottish Government has set out some pretty broad objectives around things like eradicating child poverty, strengthening public services, or indeed delivering a just transition to net zero, all of which will, among other things, require additional spending and investment. These things will require money, and so it's right that we ask, how will we pay for that? And so in this report, this is really the question that we sought to answer by looking at how can we better utilise Scotland's devolved fiscal levers as best as we possibly can to raise revenue, but also raise revenue in a way that is fair and that's just and is in line with a just transition, which is a kind of broader thematic focus of our work. Now, we're operating in quite a challenging context, I think, as Lucas already mentioned. I would argue that we're in the most challenging fiscal landscape that we've had in Scotland since the establishment of the Scottish Parliament. We've got demands on health and care and welfare, and the Scottish Government's own projections show that we're due to see a widening budget gap, so a widening gap between what money is being brought in and what is being spent. And if we are going to even just stand still and maintain existing services, we are going to need to raise revenue, and that's just to stand still before we even get on to improving public services, tackling poverty, and delivering a just transition. The Scottish Government has set out various plans to try and close this gap. And in particular, it's putting a lot of faith into being able to close much of this gap through what it calls efficiency gains. So getting the public sector to kind of pull its socks up, work harder, reduce headcount. Now, while no doubt the public sector can be more efficient, We're very skeptical of the idea that the budget gap can be completely closed by pure efficiency gains that wouldn't end up impacting frontline services and delivery. And so there's a risk that it ends up becoming a kind of Trojan horse for more austerity. The Scottish Government has also recently started tapping into one-off pots of money, like the revenue generated from the ScotWind offshore wind leasing auction, which we think that's not how that money should be spent. That should be invested for the long term. And so the kind of key finding from our analysis of the fiscal challenge is that if in Scotland we want to not just maintain but enhance the social contract that we have in Scotland and also deliver a just transition to net zero, we are going to need to raise more public revenue from taxation. There's kind of just no way around that. And if we're not willing to raise more revenue, that will inevitably lead to, well, what needs to be cut. In our view, we don't want more cuts. We don't want to repeat the mistakes from austerity in the past. So the question is, how do we raise revenue? What levers do we use, and what taxes and who pays? So when we're looking at the different tax options that we have in Scotland, we set out a bunch of principles which are sort of the guiding lights when we're assessing different tax options. And so the overarching aim, of course, is that we're trying to raise revenue. So the package of reforms that we're looking at, we're aiming for it to be revenue positive and help close that budget gap. But we're also looking for it to be fair and progressive, particularly in the framework of a just transition. It's really important that those with the broadest shoulders pay the most, and that those who are vulnerable aren't being asked to pay more, who aren't in a position to be doing that without feeling more hardship. Not every single individual tax reform necessarily needs to be progressive, but the overall package of reforms, when taken together, should absolutely be progressive. We also want reform to be efficient, and so how taxes are designed and implemented does impact the economy. It can impact the performance of the economy. Poorly designed, sort of clumsy taxes can actually have quite a detrimental effect, as is currently the case today with taxes like council tax, which we'll come on to talk about. We also want them to be relatively transparent and administratively practical. We don't want taxes that are just extremely complicated or expensive to either administer or just extremely complicated for the public to understand. It needs to be relatively easy to understand and be transparent and practical. And finally, because we're looking in the context of delivering a just transition, we also look at how we can use tax to not just raise revenue, but also to drive behavioural change in line with Scotland's net zero pathway. So how can tax be used to change incentives in the economy to align with Scotland's climate goals? Okay, so the first area that we look at is income tax. Income tax is the largest revenue raiser in Scotland today. And since income tax was devolved to the Scottish Government, we have seen the Scottish Government use these powers in recent years, focusing on increasing rates for higher earners at the top end and marginally reducing them for lower earners. Now, these reforms, I think, in our view, are merited, and I think they were justified. The key finding that we raise in the report is that if we're to raise revenue on the scale needed from income tax, we can't rely on just continuing to raise income tax at the very, very top end, because there simply aren't enough very high earners in Scotland to raise the kind of funds that are needed. And so we argue that if we are to deliver the kind of objectives that we've set out, we do need to come to terms with a slightly uncomfortable truth, which is that most of us will likely need to pay a little more tax, although that of course should be done in a way that is absolutely fair and progressive, with those who are earning more paying more and those who are paying less either only paying a little bit more or not paying any more at all. And we'll show some charts on this in just a minute. And this sort of model of, if you look at countries that have very strong public services, strong welfare states, and lower levels of inequality, for example, some of our small European neighbours in Scandinavia, etc., this is how they do it. They have progressive but broad-based taxation along with very redistributive welfare systems. And so I think if we want to deliver that kind of model, we do need to be willing to think about how our tax system needs to shift to be able to deliver that. And so in terms of income tax, what do we propose? And so this slide here shows what we recommend. And so looking at increasing the bottom three rates by 1%, and then the top three rates, the higher advanced and top rate, by 2%, with the higher rate threshold being reduced from 43,663 to 40,000. And so in terms of what this looks like in terms of distributionally, this is the chart here that you can see. You can see that the reforms are highly progressive, both in terms of a proportional impact and a cash impact, with those far higher up the income distribution paying more, both in cash terms and as a proportion of the income, with those lower down paying far less. It's important to mention as well that the lowest earning 1.5 million adults in Scotland wouldn't be impacted by these income tax changes because they're currently not earning enough to pay income tax, and so they wouldn't be paying any more income tax from these reforms. So because Scotland doesn't have control over the personal allowance. And so that's a really important principle for us, is making sure that this is fair and progressive, and that distribution really meets that criteria. So according to our modelling, these changes would raise around £1.5 billion a year. And that's after accounting for what's known as behavioural responses. So if you just run the model and you look at it on a static basis, which means before considering behavioural responses, it would raise about 1.8 billion. However, we replicate the methodology used by the Scottish Fiscal Commission to consider behavioural changes, and that would reduce it by broadly 300 million. Now, there's a large debate in the literature about the extent of behavioural effects. My sense is that this actually overestimates the impact of that. But just to kind of avoid any debate about that, we thought it was safest just to replicate the methodology from the Scottish Fiscal Commission. But in practice, I think it probably wouldn't reduce it by that much. But that's a kind of an ongoing academic debate. So £1.5 billion is obviously a significant amount, and that's every single year. And that would really help us improve the public finances, enable us to tackle these goals around poverty, public services, the NHS, and of course, a just transition as well. Moving on now to residential property. So this is where we're getting into forms of wealth, which I think really touches on what Lukas's presentation outlined before. Residential property, other words, housing, is one of the main sources of wealth in Scotland. And at the moment, we have two main taxes on residential property that are devolved to Scotland. So we have council tax, which, as Lukas mentioned, and I think is almost universally agreed at this point, is notoriously regressive as a tax, and it's also horrendously inefficient, being based on what property values were from 1991, which is the year that I was born. We also have land and buildings transaction tax, and so this is a tax that's paid upon the purchase of property. And land and buildings transaction tax it's not a tax on wealth; it's a transaction tax. So it's really a tax on mobility that people pay when they move. Now, there's a lot of evidence that LBTT and its cousin stamp duty, which LBTT replaced, is actually quite harmful tax in that it can really undermine labour market mobility and prevent people from moving to better jobs, moving for good reasons, and kind of clog up the labour market quite a bit. There's also, I think, a fairness point here with LBTT in that, as I say, it's not a tax on wealth being a tax on mobility. You could have a situation where someone on modest means has to move house for whatever reason, family work, 3 times in 6 years. They could end up paying a very large amount in LBTT. At the same time, you've got a multimillionaire living in a £10 million mansion in Edinburgh who doesn't move in that time and doesn't pay anything on that basis. And so I think both on an efficiency and a fairness perspective, there's a real argument for change here. And crucially, on this side of things, these are fully devolved. So council tax and LBTT, the Scottish Government can change this, and there's really no excuse. And so we argue that reforming these taxes can deliver a win-win, which is both a fairer and a more efficient tax system. And so in terms of what we propose to do, so we propose replacing council tax and LBTT, so replacing both of them with a single recurring property tax based on up-to-date property values. So this tax would replace council tax, but we would also take the revenue, we would also abolish LBTT and take the revenue from LBTT and roll it into this. So we're not losing revenue from getting rid of LBTT. And this would be a tax charged at 0.75% of property value. And that would be for properties up to £400,000 a year. And then there would be a surcharge of 1% over this for values over that £400,000 a year. Now, often in the debate around property tax, we hear about a proportional property tax. So that would be everyone pays the same 0.75%. And there's a very strong case for that. That's actually a very progressive reform. The reason that we have the surcharge above 400,000 is because LBTT, despite its flaws, it is somewhat progressive. And so if we're getting rid of LBTT and rolling it into this tax, we want to make sure that that it's made slightly more progressive to account for that. The exact figures, whether it's 400,000, whether it's 300,000, whether it's 500,000, that would be obviously subject to debate, and there may need to be a case where it's different thresholds in different part of the country, given the variation in property values. And taken together, we think that these two tax changes, as well as raising revenue, as well as tackling inequality and helping with fairness, could also actually have a positive impact on the economy as well by getting rid of these two very inefficient taxes. And so according to our modelling, this would raise on a net basis around £220 million a year of new revenue. Obviously, at a time when particularly local authority budgets are under extreme pressure, this would go a long way into addressing those funding shortfalls that local authorities are dealing with across the country. In terms of the distributional impact, so the additional revenue raised from this property tax reform would mainly come from higher income households, as you can see by the chart there. It's fairly progressive. Those in the bottom half of the income distribution may either pay slightly more or some may pay slightly less. As Lukas said, there is an issue when you do most forms of property tax reform based on up-to-date values where you have this asset-rich, cash-poor issue. So if you see the bottom left on the far side there, at the lowest income decile, you have the modelling showing that they would pay, a decent amount more than the other deciles ahead of it. And this is driven by things like pensioners, for example, who have built up significant wealth, maybe live in valuable houses, but which, as they're pensioners, they're not earning significant income just now. And there's various ways of dealing with that, which we can come on to talk about in relation to deferrals of various different ways. And this is an inevitable issue of doing any kind of property tax reform in practice if it's going to be based on up-to-date property values. There are a whole bunch of issues here, which I won't go into just now, but just to flag them in doing these reforms around how you protect vulnerable households. We have at the moment council tax relief, how you could adjust reliefs to make sure that we're protecting vulnerable households. The asset-rich, cash-poor problem, which I just mentioned. How do you actually value property for tax purposes if we're going to tax based on up-to-date property values? How do you do that? How often are properties revalued? It's worth saying that's often seen as a very difficult problem, whereas it's entirely common across the world. Many, many, many countries have property tax systems that are based on up-to-date property values. That's the norm. Our system of being based on 1991 values is the bizarre exception. So it's certainly not insurmountable as a problem. What will be the implications for local authority grants and redistribution between local authorities? The question of whether the new property tax should be set nationally and have it universally across the country, whether local authorities should have some autonomy to be able to set their own rates. These are all important design questions, which I think we set out some views in the report, but we recognise there's a lot more thinking on that needing to be done in a sort of participatory way. We also talk about greening a progressive property tax. Let's just touch on this very briefly. We talk about the potential to offer either penalties or discounts on the new tax on the basis of a property's EPC rating on energy efficiency, thereby creating an incentive for people to invest in energy efficiency, because if you do that, if you have a more energy efficient house, you also get a slight tax benefit as well. And so, again, just trying to align things with Scotland's climate goals and behavioural change, because we know energy efficiency in housing is a really going to be an important part if we're to meet our climate targets. So that's the residential side. Onto the non-residential side. So the main tax on the non-domestic side is what we call non-domestic rates, sometimes called business rates. That's a tax on an estimate of the value of land and buildings. Now, it's important to mention that there are a number of reliefs on non-domestic rates that exist today that actually cost the Exchequer a lot of money, which are relatively arbitrary. So the largest is the Small Business Bonus Scheme. It costs around £700 million a year. But the other one that isn't talked about much is about 85% of Scotland's land is not subject to non-domestic rates. So even though this is a tax on non-domestic property, the vast majority of land in Scotland is exempt. And that's because that land is either agricultural or wooded land. And so these types of land aren't even on the valuation roll. And so this is quite a major distortion in the tax system, because every other type of business that has property is paying this tax, your high street shops, etc. But these two types of firm are completely exempt. So we argue there is a case for looking at that, widening the tax base, looking at the reliefs that are in place, and also replacing non-domestic rates with a more effective alternative. And for us, that is a land value tax. There are lots of very strong reasons in economics why taxing the value of land is a very effective way to raise revenue. Land is there. It's a free good of nature. It's not going anywhere. It represents a very strong tax base. And so we recommend replacing non-domestic rates with a land value tax of 2.9% of market land value. And so for businesses that currently pay non-domestic rates, that would be revenue neutral for them. So it wouldn't be raising, in the immediate term, more money from those who are currently non-domestic rates payers. What we do recommend, though, is to widen the amount of land that's subject to the tax to include forestry land, which is currently exempt. Now, the reason for including forestry land is forestry has actually been pretty lucrative as a sector recently. It's been booming, benefiting from rising land values, timber prices. It already has a number of extensive tax benefits in other ways on capital gains and various other things. So it's really not clear why that is exempt as a sector while others aren't. We also look at the case for levying land value tax on agriculture as the other big exemption. We conclude that there's more analysis needed to look at whether that would be sensible or not in the immediate term. Agriculture is obviously extremely important to the economy. It is going through a difficult period. It's critical to food production. And so it's not that we think that that can't be doable. It's just that there needs to be more detailed sector analysis to look at what the impact might be, what sort of timescales might be realistic, etc. Whereas with forestry, we think that's much more clear cut. And so together, were we to do this, to introduce the land value tax at 2.9% on these types of property, we could raise nearly 500 million a year over the long term. This isn't something that could be introduced overnight. It's not something we could implement today to address the budget gap. There are lots of things that we need to be able to do, namely actually assess who owns all land, but also how we value land. Land's our most valuable asset in the economy, and yet we don't have decent estimates of what the actual value of it is. So this is over the kind of medium term, and we'd say with the right ambition in the next parliament, this could be something that could be done over the course of the next parliament with the right political will. And as on the residential side, we also talk about how to green a land value tax as well. We've had the John Muir Trust talk about a carbon emissions land tax, for example. So this was really thinking about how to integrate those sort of climate and nature aspects into a land value tax, similarly to the residential side, where you could have a penalty or a discount according to an assessment of how sustainably that land is being managed. And we have a separate report on the screen there, which kind of delves into this stuff in a bit more detail if you're interested. Moving on to air passenger travel. And so Scotland's had powers to replace air passenger duty for some time, although it's looked at it, it hasn't got around to doing it yet. Although in the most recent budget, the Scottish Government did say that it is now going to replace the UK air passenger duty with a new air departure tax, as well as a new private jet supplement. We think that's a step forward, and particularly recognising on the private jet supplement the polluter pays principle here, that there's a real link between inequality and climate change, and not everyone's contributing equally to this. And so we want to make sure that those who are polluting are paying more through the tax system. However, that's only going to impact a very small number of people. And so we recommend replacing air passenger duty instead with a frequent flyer tax. So this system where everyone would get, say, one flight a year at either no tax or very low tax, but every subsequent flight that you take would be charged at an escalating rate. So this is obviously aiming to disincentivize regular flying and encouraging people to do other modes of transport to help bring emissions from aviation down. Unsurprisingly, the number of flights households take increases as income goes up. So as you would expect, this is a relatively progressive reform in cash terms, where those in the higher income distributions would be expected to pay more. As the aim here isn't really to raise revenue, it's to change behaviour. We don't assume this is a revenue raising measure. This will be sort of broadly revenue neutral over the long term. It's mainly about changing behaviour. Okay, and so just on the screen now is just a summary of the reforms that I've talked about in terms of how much this would raise. So income tax, replacing council tax and LBTT with a new property tax, replacing non-domestic rates of the Greenland value tax, replacing air passenger duty. The final one, which I haven't touched on, which if you're interested, you can delve into in the report, is we recommend a new betterment levy, which is a tax on the uplift in the value of land that happens when planning permission is granted. So when, say, agricultural land is granted planning permission, the value of that land can skyrocket by, say, 50 times. And so this is a tax on the uplift there to ensure that that uplift is shared. It's not just captured by the landowner, it's also shared by the public purse to some extent as well. And depending on how you design that, could raise around £75 million a year as well. Just one final note, and then I will stop on wealth and carbon taxes. And so I think when we talk about taxing wealth, there's a distinction between how we tax wealth more effectively and a wealth tax. So we do look at a bespoke wealth tax, and we model that out in terms of what that would look like in Scotland. Tax Justice UK has been campaigning on a 2% wealth tax on assets over 10 million. So we do model that out, and it would raise, were that to be successful in Scotland, I think it's about £86 million a year, which isn't huge, just given a lot of the wealth over that sum is held outside Scotland and the UK. And we conclude that while there's a principal case for introducing a standalone wealth tax and aligns well with the concept of a just transition, that to do that under the existing devolved framework would be very, very challenging and unlikely to work, because the Scottish Government can't unilaterally introduce new nationwide taxes in Scotland without Westminster's approval. So it would need to be administered at the local authority level. And there's lots of reasons why I think trying to administer a wealth tax at the local authority level is unlikely to succeed. And similarly on carbon taxation, there's very strong sort of theoretical merits for carbon taxing in terms of delivering our climate goals. Trying to do that again at the Scottish level would be very challenging. It would also likely be regressive and would require quite big redistribution to address that, which Scotland doesn't currently have the levers to address. And so when it comes to a standalone wealth tax and a carbon tax, we recommend that the Scottish Government takes this up at the UK level in terms of trying to engage with the UK government about whether there could be a UK version of these taxes. But as I say, we're very clear in the report that our aim is definitely to tax wealth more effectively, and that's why we focus so heavily on property taxation as the main basis of wealth taxation that we can control in Scotland. Okay, I will stop there. Thanks very much. Looking forward to hear questions.
All right, thank you, Laurie, and thank you, Lukas, as well, for those brilliant presentations. There's so much there to digest. So I'm sure everybody's been taking notes and thinking hard. And while you all have the chance to formulate questions, I'll just wrap up this part by saying a bit more about Tax Justice Scotland, the campaign that both our organisations are part of. So the Tax Justice Scotland campaign is backed by a really diverse set of organisations, both We All Scotland and Future Economy Scotland, other think tanks, trade unions, economists, academics, so individuals involved in that as well. And we would encourage all of you, if you're interested in campaigning, getting involved in this campaign for creating a fairer Scottish tax system, to get involved in that. And Chloe's going to put the link in the chat there. So we collaborate to challenge unjust tax structures and advocate for reforms like these that you've just heard about from Laurie. And Tax Justice Scotland's outlined 5 different steps that you can see on the website if you want to know more about that. So we can now open up for questions, and we can stop recording.